you so much for attending. I have the great pleasure this evening of being able to introduce our speakers who are guardians of two of the greatest portfolios of wine estates in the world of wine. Some I have known for many, many years, some less so. And the reason that we are getting together is to discuss 2018 vintage port, partly because we have a small offer of vintage port about to come out. And so we thought, what better opportunity than to hear all about it from the horse's mouth. I believe that our speakers have the wines, and so they can talk to us very specifically. I was lucky enough to taste the wines with them a few weeks ago when the wines were presented to the press in just this same sort of format, actually, to the press and to the trade. So just to give a little bit of background, it's been fascinating hearing about the 2018 vintage, a complicated one, it seems, not least ending up with really quite small volumes. And it sounds as if it was one of lots of changes, thrills and spills, if you like. And I'm sure we will hear all about that and about the kind of variety that you get in terms of your location and different grape varieties and how they performed. So we are going to be hearing from the Symington family, who have released 2 of the 6 ports that they've made. And I guess that they will touch on all of those. But first, we're going to hear from Christian Seely, who has been the managing director of Noval, Quinta de Noval, for 27 years. I think you said when we met recently, Christian. In recent years, I've seen you more at Pichon-Baron in Bordeaux, which is where you were when we last spoke, because I used to come regularly for the Primeur tastings. Now we just get to meet at port events, which is fantastic. So I'm going to ask Christian to start, if I may. Over to you. And you just need to unmute yourself, Christian.
There we are.
There we go.
I'm unmuted. Okay. Well, it's great to have the opportunity to talk about the 2018 vintage port. I'm actually at Quinta de Noval in the Douro right now, and it's a very lovely summer here at the moment, rather hot, in fact. Few words about Quinta de Noval, first of all. Quinta de Noval is, of course, one of the iconic vineyards of the Douro Valley and indeed of the world. It's a very large vineyard. It's 145 hectares in the heart of the Douro Valley, in 3 main parcels. There's a big parcel of Quinta de Noval in the Pinhão Valley. There's another one in the Roncão Valley. And then there's another one that overlooks the Douro itself. All these parcels are pretty close to each other, but that does mean that in this one vineyard, we have many different expositions, quite significant climatic variances. And so from one year to another, it may well be that we get absolutely outstanding wines from the Roncão Valley parcels, and then other years it's the Pinhão Valley parcels. But so within one large vineyard, we have different performances in terms of quality and style from year to year, which is part of the fascination of managing a property like this and making the blends for the wine from such a vineyard. So Quinta de Noval is always a vintage port from one single vineyard. That's just the nature of the beast, and it's probably fair to say that we are slightly eccentric in our policy of declaring vintage ports, in that we probably do it rather more than most people. But although we have a large vineyard, we're really quite a small player in the world of port, and so we very often make really extremely small quantities of vintage port, and that was the case in 2018, where we just made 1,600 cases, and that represents about 7% of the production of the vineyard. A vintage port, whoever's declaring it, whoever's making it, is always a wine of extreme selection. We just select the very, very best lots to make the vintage port. And so if you're only using, in our case in 2018, 7% of your production, that gives you an idea of the dedication to the idea of making the highest quality wine we possibly can, and what we're prepared to do in terms of sacrificing volume in order to get it. Anyway, 2018, I think is an outstanding vintage port for Quinta Noval. Just a very few words about the year. I'm sure that the Symingtons will talk more specifically about weather, but just broadly speaking, of course, I guess you know that we had a wonderful year the year before, 2017. But 2017 was completely different to 18. It was 17 was extremely hot, but extremely dry, almost drought conditions, and that those dry conditions of 17 continued right through the winter and right into the beginning of 2018. So we had a really prolonged dry period, which was actually quite worrying, where rainfalls were significantly lower than usual. And had we not had rain in the spring of 2018, things would have not have been so good. But fortunately, we had a lot of rain in the end, in spring. Having said that, the rain was very welcome, but it then probably went on rather longer than one might have wanted it to, which gave us some quite serious difficulties during the flowering period, which actually reduced the potential yield. So the rain was essential to restock the levels of water in the soil, but it was there was a lot of it, and it made things quite difficult. Fortunately, after the summer began, once we moved into June, July, we started having wonderful sunny weather, with some very interesting, really hot periods, actually. We had a little bit of rain at the end of August, beginning of September, and that's usually a very good thing. And we also had a very hot, sunny, warm September. So what you basically had in 2018 was enough rain at the beginning of the year to make sure that there was enough water in the soil, and a prolonged sunny ripening period. And the result is there were some absolutely gorgeous wines made, not only ports, but also the red wines. But 2018 is a lovely year. And for me, I was delighted to declare this as a Quinta Noval vintage port. And actually, yesterday, I just to keep my eye in, I did a little vertical of 15, 16, 17, and 18, just to make sure that all four of those declarations were up to scratch. And I confirm that 2018 is a very worthy member of that lineup. For me, it's a great historic vintage for Quinta Noval, and I love the wine.
And Christian, I think weren't you hit by hail? So those who are familiar with the National vineyard, I think you weren't able to make any National this year, were you?
That's true. That was the sad part about 2018, because I'm sure that most people know that at the heart of the Quinta Noval vineyard, we have the great, it's both great and tiny, the great vineyard of National, but it's a tiny parcel. It's just under 2 hectares right in the heart of Quinta Noval. And we had a terrible hailstorm in the late spring, which unfortunately the epicenter of it was the National parcel, and about 5 or 6 hectares around that parcel. Quinta Noval is as I said, in many different areas around the house. So we basically lost the production of about 7 hectares. And unfortunately, 2 of those were the National. So there was no National in 2018. Hail is very often very site specific, and it normally either hits you or your neighbor. And of course, as Dominic is one of my neighbors, I could hardly wish it to have fallen on my neighbor instead of me. But it does leave you feeling, in a rather fist-shaking mood at the sky when it just falls on some of your best parcels. But these things happen. And so there's no national, but fortunately, nature was very generous with us for the rest of the year. And we had some absolutely wonderful wines from other parts of the vineyard. So it was possible to make a great Quinta de Noval, even though there's no national.
And I know when we spoke recently, you said you could have made more. You could have made more vintage port this year. It wouldn't have been this vintage port, and that alludes to what you were talking about earlier about that severe selection.
Yes, I think that when you're responsible for a great vintage port name like Quinta de Noval, you feel that you have a responsibility to if you're going to bottle a wine as a vintage port bearing the Quinta de Noval name, first of all, it must be extremely good, but it must also be faithful to the spirit and style of great historic Noval vintages in the past. And so when you're doing the blending, we made 1,600 cases. We could perfectly easily have made 5, 6, 7,000 cases of vintage port, and it would have been a very good vintage port, but it wouldn't have been the blend that we had. And that blend was a much smaller quantity, but it was just the blend we wanted to make. It was just lovely, and so that was the decision we took. And we always work in that way and make those kind of decisions. We could make much more vintage port always, but it's not so much about how much, but how great, and that's what we want. We want it to be as great as it can possibly be every time. Absolutely.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the moment. I'm sure there will be questions following up on that. I'd like to move on now to the Symingtons, Dominic and Harry. Dominic I have known for many, many years, since what I call my first proper job in the wine trade. When I think it was the very first time I'd actually heard Portuguese being spoken, and I couldn't get my head around it. I was a French speaker, but I just couldn't get my head around Portuguese, which Dominic and many of the family speak fluently. And the other thing that I particularly remember about those times, Dom, was that you were very generous with your educational tastings over lunch on Fridays, usually when the bosses were out, as far as I recall. But I have very good memories of that time. But what is fantastic to see, when you've been in the trade as long as I have, it's great now to see the new generation, the latest, the 5th generation of the family now very involved in the business. Whence Harry, so welcome Harry as well. So please take us to your two vineyards, your 2 wines.
Thanks very much, Joe. Hello everyone. I'm Harry. I'm a member of the 5th generation of our family to produce wine in Portugal. I'm here with my uncle Dominic, as Joe mentioned, and we're very excited to present our 2018 vintage ports to you this evening. I'm just going to start by explaining how we came to our decision to release these wines, and then give a brief overview of the year. So how do we come to our decision to bottle these wines? Well, once the dust had settled on the 2018 harvest, our assessment was that we had produced small quantities of excellent wines from specific parcels at some of our top estates. But the quality was not consistent across the region to meet our extremely high standards to make a general vintage port declaration. So when our family, we gathered together in the tasting room, which is where we are now, with Charles, who's my cousin, our head winemaker, and we reviewed the top 2018 wines with vintage port potential. Our assessment was that in order to do justice to the best expression of the 2018 harvest, that we should release the vintage ports individually as single quinta vintage ports, rather than blend the top wines from each of our port houses' top estates into a super blend, the so-called general vintage port declaration. So with the 2018s, we feel we have bottled absolutely stunning single estate, single quinta vintage ports, which in very small quantities, which we believe can certainly hold their own against classic vintage ports. So what have we produced? As Joe mentioned earlier, we have actually produced 6 single quinta vintage ports from our principal estates. For us, they represent the absolute pinnacle of the 2018 harvest. And they are a fantastic reflection of the terroir of our top estates. So of the 6 vintage ports, we have chosen these 2 to release this year, Quinta de Vesuvio and Dows's Quinta de Senhora de Ribeira. The other 4 estate single quinta vintage ports will continue to age in our cellars, and we will release them at a later date. So what's the story of the year? Well, as Christian's already mentioned, 2018 was certainly a roller coaster year with extremely challenging conditions. The viticultural year actually began in a state of drought. There had been 20 consecutive months of rainfall well below average. And this ended with unprecedented rainfall through spring. It meant that bud break was actually 3 weeks later than average. And then the spring rainfall, as Christian's already mentioned, culminated in this absolutely extraordinary storm on the 28th of May, where we did have hail and some localized rain damage. And then if that wasn't enough, through the final ripening period in August, we had these heat waves, which posed a risk. Despite the challenges, there were 3 factors that contributed favorably to the year. The first is that the vines benefited in the very hot final ripening period from the increased soil moisture from the spring rainfall. The second is that the late maturing Toriga Franca flourished in the warm harvest days, which was around 1 to 2 degrees warmer than average. And this contributed lovely lifted aromas in the wines. And the third is that the wines themselves are balanced by a very well-defined acidity, which just shows the incredible adaptation of our indigenous grape varieties in the Douro. So before we get on to the wines, I'd just like to say that our family has been producing port in the Douro for 5 generations. And what this means is that Charles, pictured here, our winemaker, and his team of winemakers, they have multi-generational knowledge to be able to skillfully blend individual parcels from each estate with variations in altitude, aspect, and grape variety. And this type of knowledge is especially important in a year like 2018, when we had such challenging conditions. And it allows us to consistently produce vintage ports that are well structured, balanced, concentrated, and refined. And we hope that you agree when you get to taste them. So I'm now just going to hand over to Dom to talk a bit about the Vesuvio, the first wine.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Joe, I was trying to work out when it was that we first met, but I daren't say it in public because I think both of us would be too embarrassed to admit that it was such a long time ago. But just to pick up on a couple of points that both Harry and Christian mentioned, the storm that happened, that hit the Douro on the 28th of May, brought in 1 hour of rainfall in the Pinhal Valley between, and I know that you tried to push the hail over to our side of the valley from yours, but sadly it hit us both. But I think something that one has to see is that we had 80 millimeters of rain in 1 hour, including part of that time was hail. 80 millimeters of rain for the English, or for in Britain that is maybe still not metric. That's just over 3 inches of rain in an hour's time. I mean, that's extraordinary. I mean, that would fill up anybody's swimming pool just in that 1 hour. I mean, it was an extraordinary amount of rain, and it did some catastrophic damage to hail. Hail does something really quite strange, is that you can have a band of a couple of 100 meters wide, and it'll go through it and be literally like a lawnmower, but 10 yards to the right or to the left of it, everything is more or less untouched. But the effect is, I mean, it's heartbreaking, to put it mildly, and particularly when you have a magical vineyard like the Noval Nacional. You know, it really is, it doesn't bear thinking about, but there we are. It was a complicated year. Luckily, from the storm, the storms didn't. We had the rainfall, but we didn't have the catastrophic storm acting to the Vesuvio, which is further east from the Pinhão Valley. It's about another 30 kilometers up, going eastwards up the Douro River. We have and it's generally rather warmer in the eastern reaches of the Douro. Vesuvio, however, has a very particular sort of positioning and climate, whereby it's on the south bank and it's north facing. So although it's a hotter region than around Pinhão, being north facing, it means it doesn't get attacked by the sun quite so much, because it has what we term as an oblique sun angle. So the sun's rays don't hit it front on, they hit it at an angle. And so therefore the natural canopy and the angle of the mountain largely protects it from the worst aspect. The other thing about Vesuvio is it's a very large property. It's over 350 acres, so that's over 350 hectares. That's over 1,000 acres, and we also have a most extraordinary height variation inside the property. The lowest lying vineyard is just over 110 meters above sea level, and the highest point of the property is a fraction under 500 meters. That basically gives 1,000 foot, so 330 meter height variation inside one vineyard. And so, as Harry was mentioning, it gives us an incredible palette of color to play with when we have a challenging year, in that we've got the altitude that plays, that gives us the difference. So higher up is necessarily fresher, lower down vineyards are a bit more concentrated, hotter, riper type wines. And so it gives us an extraordinary balance to play with. And again, as Harry said, we had it was a year where the Toriga Franca was, as we can see on the note at the moment, absolutely flourished. It's a very late ripening variety, and it needs needs heat to reach its peak. And the secret was that, as we all three of us have mentioned already, was the fact of having this the water reserves in the soil from the spring rainfall actually soars through the worst effects of the summer, those various spikes of heat. And so the vines actually never went into shutdown. And so we had some very balanced maturation. And then we have some very fine, again, as Harry said, we've got some very fine acidity in the wine that is giving it its freshness. And then one it'll give it that lovely freshness that you get from vintage port. And then it'll also be part of the backbone that'll give these wines an extraordinary longevity. So we've got some very concentrated wines, but very aromatic, and then with this lovely elegance and freshness that comes through on the after palate when we taste them. So, you know, it is a very, very exciting year. As Harry mentioned, we opted to make our wines from our estates, and in a way, almost following what Christian does with having an estate wine from one of the great estates of the world at Noval. We've done the Vesuvio. We follow the same sort of model of being an exclusive estate wine, and we've got these, as I say, these beautifully fresh, floral aromatic wines, but with a sort of a deep, dark heart inside them that then will give it some longevity into the future.
Great. So the second wine that we're going to talk about is Senhora of Ribeira. So as Dom has described Vesuvio, Senhora of Ribeira actually sits directly opposite Vesuvio on the other side of the river. So it's a southeast facing estate. And in comparison to Vesuvio, it is tiny. It's only 25 hectares under vine. The name itself, Senhora of Ribeira, actually means Lady of the River, which is named after the ancient chapel that you can just see there on the ridge. And it actually marks an ancient river crossing point. So people would come down, they'd bless themselves before going across the river. And you can see the river now is actually full. This is before the river was dammed, so they need to have a sort of blessing before they went across. Senhora of Ribeira is one of the two principal estates that makes up Dow's vintage ports since 1890, and it's particularly close to our family's heart, because it was actually one of the first estates, one of the first quintas that my great-great-grandfather started farming in 1912. All of the grapes are vinified on site in the estate's small winery. And the wines themselves, the typical Senhora of Ribeira style is very full, very dark wines with incredible structure. And the 2018 Senhora of Ribeira, as a result of the much warmer conditions, has delivered a much riper, a much richer style of Senhora of Ribeira that we've previously seen. Another note is that Charles took the decision to co-ferment Suzanne and Alicante Boucher for the first time at Senhora of Ribeira, which delivers an extraordinary, a wonderful structure and extraordinary color to the wine. And then on the nose, you get the typical, the estate's signature violet and a hint of fresh mint. It's a fantastic wine and a fantastic reflection of the Quinta's terroir, and also the challenges that 2018 threw at us. We've actually only bottled 510 cases of the wine. This represents just 8% of the Quinta's total production, and we hope you enjoy it when you get the chance to taste it.
Drink it.
Harry, thank you very much indeed for that. And I think just in that short summary between the three of you, we've had that sort of fascinating insight into the fact that you're talking about one vineyard, you know, large or small, but they're all, you know, single estates, all in one area, if you like, but there's tremendous variety within that site. And that's what gives you those different building blocks. And for those who have lucky enough to been to the Douro, you will know, like many wine regions, that you have very, very different aspects within a single vineyard. So yes, these are site-specific wines, but there's a lot of variety within that site. You know, that coupled with the mix of grape varieties, which to me is infinitely fascinating. So thank you very much for that. Now let's see, Anna, would you like to take us to some questions?
I think so, yes. It's a question for both of you, really. So perhaps if we start with Christian, and then we go on to the Symingtons. We've had a few members ask about the longevity of aging vintage port, and what is the prime window, do you think, potentially for this vintage, but for in general, how long should one keep vintage port?
Okay.
So Christian, perhaps first.
Well, I have a glass of the 2018 Quinta Noval vintage port, which I've been sipping as we've been talking, and I can tell you the drinking window starts now.
Totally agree.
But I can confidently predict that it will continue for very, very many decades. Great vintage port is one of the most long-lived wines in the world. I've occasionally had the good luck to be at tastings of very old vintage ports from Quinta Noval, from the 40s, from the 30s, from the 20s, and sometimes even from the 19th century. And you know, if it's a good bottle, they're usually alive and well. So they have this wonderful characteristic of being wines that can you know, age in time, and they can accompany you through your life, or they can accompany a family through several generations. There are some vintage ports that I used to drink with my dad, who's no longer with us, alas, and I can still drink the wines today anyway, and they taste a little bit different. They don't taste that much different. Actually, the first great vintage port I ever had was a Dow 1955 with my dad, and I occasionally manage to drink a bottle of Dow 55 these days, and it reminds me of that great moment that was 40 years ago. So great vintage port, it does have this wonderful characteristic of being incredibly seductive and fun to drink when it's young, but you can keep it as long as you like, and really as long as you're able to. And what that really means is that it's absolutely imperative to buy several cases, because otherwise you're going to run out.
Fabulous. And Symington duo, would you concur?
Couldn't agree more with Christian, and I think perhaps probably the most important thing that Christian just said is that actually, if you think about it, and we've got our 218s here in front of us, and they are absolutely delicious today. I mean, they're these wines, and so you don't have to wait half a lifetime until you first taste these wines, because it's an adventure to start tasting the wine now and enjoying it. And there's going to be this wonderful evolution of the wine as it goes through its various phases of life, rather like we do. And certainly at my age, I think I'm an awful lot better than I was when I was 19 or 20, much against my wife's better judgment. But there's an evolution in wine. And I think that if one looks on it like that, that to wait, the enjoyment of having it now it's almost like sort of putting jam on toast at breakfast. It's so delicious, and then as it evolves, it takes on different phases and flavors, and it has then nuances come out in it, and it's just a constant pleasure. And every time one tastes, one opens another bottle, I mean, there's always a new adventure, and be it any one of the three wines that we're speaking about today, or even some of our friends' wines from it's always an adventure, and it's always exciting, and it's always a huge pleasure. I think just to pick up on one little point on that, the temperature of serving the wine is obviously quite important. The tradition that we do is that we think that we should drink vintage port at room temperature. The problem is our grandparents' room temperature is substantially different from what ours is today, and so really one ought to cool it down a little bit before serving.
Fantastic, thank you very much, all three of you. I have a question from Jeff Paris, who has asked a question directly to the Symingtons. He wondered, you mentioned you have 6 single Quinta wines, and what was the logic behind releasing only 2 of those wines?
We established a bit of a tradition with releasing, when we acquired Quinta del Vesuvio in 1989, thank you, Harry. When we acquired Quinta del Vesuvio in 1989, we decided that we would follow a little bit the principle of an estate, single estate, very much like Christian has with Noval. And because the rest of my family's involvement in port are the other brands. However, from a market point of view and commercially, they are also two moments where the market looks for wines, and so whereby we release Quinta del Vesuvio and Senhora de Ribeira as we are doing now. The wines from Douw's Quinta de Bolfin, Graham's Quinta de Smalverdos, and the other two, so Wars Cavadinha and Coben's Canage. We age those ourselves for 10, 12 years or so, and then release them, and then that allows us to be able to offer wines that are at the next stage of their drinking life, and primarily for the restaurant business around the world. All those people that don't have a wine cellar and would like to have some wines a little bit older, having the luxury of having various different properties in the Douro allows us to release some wines for the collectors when they're young, and then some wines later on when they've already gone through the first phase of their maturation.
Fabulous, thank you very much. I think hopefully, Jeff, that's cleared that one up. The next question is from Alex Bridgman, again for both of you, so perhaps Christian, if we could start with you, but also maybe your opinion, Joe, as well. Is 2018 a good year for Colheita ports as well?
Well, I think that if a year is a good year for vintage ports, it's very likely that it's going to be a good year for Colheita ports as well. Colheita ports, just to anyone who's unsure about the matter, Colheita ports, like vintage ports, are wines from a single harvest, but unlike vintage ports, they're wines that we age in barrel for many years before we finally bottle them and release them. If vintage port is the great wine of the Douro, I think that Colheita ports have a right to be considered as the other great port wine of the Douro, much less well known because of tradition and history, but they are some of the most beautiful wines around. Here at Noval, I've been laying down wine for Colheita ports ever since I arrived, which was 27 years ago now, and my first one was the 1995, so after that we made the 97, then we made the 2000, then we made the 2003, then we had the 2005. All those years were very good years for vintage port, but they were also very good years for Colheita. And in the case of Quinta Noval, when I lay down wine to make a Colheita, we're talking minuscule quantities. So it would be less than 1% of the production of the Quinta might go aside in barrels to be set aside to age for it. The minimum is 7 years, but here at Noval we wait at least 12 years before we release a Colheita, and we will, I'm quite sure, be laying down some wine from or setting aside some wine from 2018 to make a Colheita. I'm sure it's the year is it's a wonderful year, and Colheitas also they tend to be particularly successful from these very aromatic styles of years, and 2018 is like that. And so yeah, I think give it about 10 years, and you can look forward to a 2018 Colheita Quinta Noval, Alex.
Fantastic, thank you. Dom, Harry, any other thoughts on that?
Alex, and then I mirroring what Christian has said. I mean that invariably a great vintage year will produce wines that, be they having the potential to age in the bottle, will also in cask. And so yes, the chances are that all the indications are that the 18s will also potentially be some great later wines, but you do need to work, because legally we can't release them until they're 7 years old. And as Christian said, generally speaking, we keep the wines in cask for longer and let them evolve, get a bit more complexity. But I mean, Colheitas are within a Colheita is a tawny port. So by nature, it's a single year tawny port rather than a blended tawny port of multiple years. And their wines are absolutely outstanding and delicious and huge complexity. So I think the chances are, yes, we will be having some.
I think if I can just add a brief comment there as well. There's been a sort of a growing interest in Colheita ports as well over recent years. So I think it's very exciting to think that some of these recent vintages are going to contribute to stocks of those wines for the future. And I think your answers go a little way to answering one of the other questions we've had, which is about what happens to all the rest. And I remember asking Paul Symington that very question a few years ago, where you have, whether it's a smaller estate like Senhora de Ribeira or one of the larger estates like Noval or Vesuvio, you're producing large quantities of very high quality wine. My interpretation of that is that you guys also make extremely good other qualities of wine, whether they be crusted or traditional LBV, or so there is a home for this other wine, allowing you to just take the absolute cream of the crop for your vintage wines, whether they be vintage port or Colheita port.
I think it comes back to the question or the statement again that Christian said earlier, which is there's absolutely no compromise on quality when it comes to our flagship wine, which is our vintage port. And as he rightly said, I mean, we could easily make more of it, and possibly people would then say, well, that's better because then there's less allocation of wine and everybody can get what they want. But there is, as Joe, as you say, I mean, there's the cream on the top of the milk, and that is as we know from the past, I mean, that's a very small quantity. And if we're going to make wines that are absolutely the best of the best, we cannot compromise, and we just have to go we have to go for what is the best. I don't wish to denigrate the rest of the wines that are there, because as you said, thank you, they are all absolutely outstanding. But necessarily within a vineyard property, there are some vineyards that get too old and they have to, from an economic point of view, they have to be replanted. And so those vineyards will be used for some of the more, what you could term the more commercial wines in their first few years of life. And then as they evolve and they age and they start delivering wines with greater complexity, they'll go into the reserve wines or the late bottle vintage style of wine. And at the same time, either they be Colletatores will be going into the aging profile of the wines. And then we also have the blended 10 and 20-year-old and the 30, and some houses have a 40-year-old. So it's a blended wine with an average of that age. Just the nature of keeping a wine in cask for 40 years before you're going to blend and bottle it, it's got to be absolutely outstanding at birth to be able to last and then be something that is beautifully balanced and structured after this time. So that we're playing, I come back to that term, and we're playing with an artist's palette of the wines from within one property, and that's how we're trying to develop what we have.
And I think for us, we do have the ability to produce vintage quality wine in all years, but the very worst. So what that means for us is that we won't be producing more, as Christian and Dom have already mentioned. It's just that the quality bar has risen. So what this means for the single quinta vintage ports that we produce, it means that those that are buying them and enjoying them now and later are getting a fantastic quality vintage port, even though we've only produced a small amount of it.
If I can say something specific to Noval, which I think actually has general implications. I think that the way that we work in the vineyards these days is, incomparably better than it used to be. And the vineyards are in a better state, and we have very much more high quality wine every year than we used to. At Quinta Noval, it was a very specific thing. We have a 145 hectare vineyard. We replanted 100 hectares in 7 years in the 1990s, which was rather a dramatic experience at the time. But it was. I'm very glad we did it now, because if you stick around long enough, the long term happens. And Noval was perhaps an extreme case of that, but I think that generally speaking, high quality producers in the Douro have been, working very hard on their vineyards. And if I talk specifically about the case of Noval, what all that work that we did in the vineyards 25 years ago now means is that we have a very great vineyard planted with wonderful noble varietals, all entering in the prime of their life. So in a beautiful year like 2018, we can really have the luxury of choosing a small lot to make an absolutely extraordinary vintage port. But we've got a lot of very good wine that's been produced in that year. That we can set aside wine to make colleitas, we can set aside wine to make superb late bottled vintages, and then also the wines that will become 10-year-old, 20-year-old, 40-year-old tawny ports. And we are in a very luxurious position compared to how we were before. And I think that's the result of this huge long-term investment in quality that has taken place in the Douro Valley. And I think port in general has never been as good as it is today. And that's part of the reason. That's not the only reason, but it's part of it.
Fabulous. Thank you all very much. I'm going to combine the next few questions because we have had a couple of questions about how you might handle a vintage port. So we had a question from Roland Hughes asking if there is a time that you should recork a vintage port, if you're keeping hold of it. And a member, Chris, has also asked what is the best way to store vintage port. So perhaps if Symingtons, we could start with you this time. Any thoughts on recorking, but also best advice for people storing their vintage ports?
Storing laid down in your wine cellar in good conditions, just like you store any wine that is for long-term storage. It's got to be in the dark, in the cool, with a relatively stable temperature. Even if your cellar isn't at sort of 13 or 12 or 13 degrees Celsius, If it's a little bit warmer, the most important is it to be stable rather than to fluctuate. Lying down in the dark, obviously. Recorking from our point of view is something that preferably should be avoided if you can. But if it is necessary, I mean, it's quite difficult to do because to return single bottles, in the past, it used to be done much more frequently, but to be honest, nowadays, it's not very easy. If you have a little bit, if you begin to have a tiny little bit of leakage on the cork, I would recommend getting a bit of sealing wax and dipping it and dropping it over the top of the bottle, over the neck or the capsule of it. That would help it a little bit. But generally, if you can avoid recorking, I would recommend you avoid recorking. Christian, I'm not sure what you would think, but.
I completely agree about the storage conditions. Of course, recorking is it's not actually something that comes up very often. But I actually have the same policy at Noval as I do at Pichon Baron, which is that if somebody contacts us and says they've got some very old wine and they want it recorked, well, first of all, you have to know a little bit more about it, and we will do it. But on various quite specific conditions. If it's just one bottle, it's not going to work. But if someone has a case of wine they want recorking, so we will recork the wine for you, but you have to be there. So you have to come along, and we will open all the bottles. We will taste them all. We will not put a Noval cork back in the bottle if the bottle is not in good condition, and that's why you have to be there so that you agree. And it's quite likely that if we're going to recork some old wines and there's 12 bottles, you're going to walk away with 11 because we're going to use one of them to fill up the ullage on the others. And if people accept all those conditions, then we'll recork for them, and we'll recork with them, and probably invite them to lunch as well. But it's something that I think it really is a very delicate issue, because that's why we wouldn't do it if someone just sent in some bottles and said, can you please recork them? The person has to be there. They have to understand, if we pull a cork on a bottle and it's the wine's oxidized and gone, we can't just recork it again. And if you accept the terms, then and you've got an old case of Quinta Noval, give us a call. That's the basis on which we would do it. But it doesn't happen very often, quite frankly.
And I think that's one reason why you're all using very serious corks on these wines. These are wines that are meant to age for a long time. And although I would say port is one of the wines where you can take slightly more risk with cellaring. This is not a this is a sort of don't do as I do, do as I say sort of thing. I have been fortunate enough to have not destroyed bottles of port that I have not kept in perfect conditions. The very nature of the wine is that they are more robust than a lot of table wine, inevitably. However, the key thing is that cork, if that cork is going to maintain a good seal, it needs to be in contact with the wine. So, if you have a bit of variation in your conditions, don't worry so much, improve on that when you can. But yeah, make sure that the wine is lying down so that you've at least got that contact with the cork, and you're going to keep that cork in the best possible condition.
Thank you all very much. Although, Christian, it does sound like it might be worth getting things recorked to go for lunch. Might be worth the trip after all. We've had a few questions about aging, and I know, Christian, you're obviously very keen on saying they can be drunk young, but a question, and possibly starting with you, Joe, in terms of being a buyer of port. Do you find that long drinking windows can actually put people off buying port?
I certainly have found that increasingly we have been getting feedback from members of the Wine Society that say, I'm too old now to buy vintage port because it's not going to be ready for drinking for me. And if I'm going to leave it to the kids. Actually, I think one of the advantages of the changes that you've all spoken about this evening the work in the vineyards, that extra selection, is that you are now producing wines which they've got the aging potential, but they are much more accessible in their youth. And I know, Harry, I think it was your brother Rod that touched on it when you did the trade presentation, talking about the fact that the higher volume wines with less selection, particularly let's say back in the 80s, those wines would have been nowhere near as drinkable as they are now in their early youth. So I think at the end of the day, it's a matter of how you like your wine. If you really like your wine very mature when it gets to that wonderful, elegant fragility that vintage port can take on over many, many years, then you have to take a view about how long you're going to be around, or whether you want to leave it to the next generation for their education. But I think that's a good thing too. But equally, you can get so much pleasure from these wines when they are still relatively young. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is actually, as we get older, many of us have a slightly sweeter tooth. So when the wine is still a little bit younger and a little bit more vigorous with a bit more of its fruit, it'll deliver a little bit more fruit and texture on the palate, as opposed to the wines which inevitably do become they feel a little drier as they get older in life. So I don't know whether you guys would agree with any of that, but that's how it seems to me.
I mean, I'd agree. I like the point around it's a matter of preference. I think it's also interesting just to see how they do evolve. So you can enjoy it when they're first produced, and you get to see the excitement, and it's not quite sort of settled, and it's almost like walking into a room and everyone's kind of shouting. So you've got the aromas and the flavors and things, and then it does start to settle down. But that's not to say that it's not enjoyable at this point, and then you see how it evolves. So again, it's a matter of preference. I would say that actually seeing that evolution is quite an exciting thing.
I think it's also a little bit, I mean, I don't think I know anybody on this planet who doesn't like chocolate, or particularly some sort of quite strong chocolate form of pudding. And, you know, in reality, a younger port, and even these 18s, will be absolutely delicious with any form of chocolate, because you'll get the richness, as Joe, as you were mentioning, you'll get the richness, and that the ripeness of the fruit will act as a counterbalance, because chocolate actually is quite tart and can be quite acidic as well. And a 30, 40, 50-year-old vintage port actually will probably be a bit too delicate, and neither your chocolate pudding or your port will benefit. And so it's very much, it's horses for courses as well. I mean, and I think that is what, and I think this brings up the excitement of the vintage port, where it is so incredibly versatile that you really can enjoy it pretty much, well, you can enjoy it factually at any point in its life, be it young with a big, rich, voluptuous flavors, or be it much more delicate and the very delicate and very precise, much older vintage ports. I mean, you've got complexity and nuances in both, but in very different sort of aspects.
I think also it's fair to point out that I was talking before about the quality of work that goes on in the vineyards these days compared to before. That precision in the vineyard is part of the reason why young vintage ports are so attractive when they're young these days. I think they are definitely more attractive these days than they used to be. We used to talk about a young vintage port having to have a lot of grip, and of course it's very good to have a bit of grip, but sometimes they were, there was so much grip that it was not that much fun to drink them when they were young. And I think that there is a precision in the way that we work with the fruit in the vineyard. There's a selection. It's not just about selecting when we blend the wines. It's about the selection that takes place when the grapes come into the winery. We have sorting tables as the grapes come into the lagars, just to make sure that the purest and best fruit is what's going into the winery. And as a result of that, you have wines that I think they're purer, and the tannins are finer, and the wines are more approachable when they're young than they used to be. That doesn't mean at all that they won't age for many decades. I don't think there's a trade-off against approachability, against durability. On the contrary, I think because you've got these wonderfully beautiful, balanced, harmonious, fresh and elegant wines, that means that everything's there for a long aging. But it does mean that I think young vintage port is more fun to drink now, young, than perhaps it used to be a few decades ago.
Fabulous. Thank you very, very much, all of you. That question was from Graham Finch, so thank you, Graham, for submitting that question. We've actually had a lot of people ask a similar question in various ilks, so I will combine it. And perhaps if we could go to the Symingtons first and ask, compared to previous vintages, is the 2018 like any other vintage? Which would you compare it to most?
We were discussing that earlier on this evening. It's a terribly difficult question to answer because every year is very individual. Every year has its little nuances. If we think about a hot year, possibly, which is generally what the overriding effect of despite the sort of the roller coaster of 18, possibly 1995, but to try to hang a tag on it, to be honest, I'd rather sort of hold my cards close to my chest for the moment than do so, because every year is different, no matter how subtle it is. I think it's what is clear, it was a hotter year, and I think that comes through in the wines to a degree. But I think Christian's previous comments, and Joe mentioned as well, the knowledge that we have and the vineyard practices today, but here one can actually say globally in every aspect of the wine business, whatever type of wine you're making, I mean, be it at Pichon in Bordeaux or in the Douro or even some other parts of the world, the knowledge we have today and the way we manage our vineyards is so, it's diametrically opposite what my father was doing 40, 50 years ago. I mean, it's just, it's a different world. And Joe, you know that very well from your side. And what it means, and Christian, what you mentioned, it means that when we're picking the grapes, we're picking them absolutely at the right moment. And I know that you do it at Noval and we do it at our Quintas at Vesuvio and Senhora Ribeira and our other ones, is that sometimes the pickers go in and they will pick 3 or 4 terraces, but then they will leave the other 5 or 6 within that same vineyard, and they'll come back to them 3 days later, because an extra couple of meters in altitude have made a significant difference in the maturation of that fruit. And so we're picking those wines when there is the perfect balance between the tannins and the acid, the sugars and the phenolics, the colors, the aromatic components, compounds in the grapes. And so the difference makes these wines absolutely the perfect moment for drinking them. And so the science of viticulture has just moved on to such a degree that it's given us this extraordinary balance in the wines.
Fantastic. And Christian, would you agree? And do you think that there is a vintage that's comparable with 2018?
Well, I'm absolutely terrible poker player, so I just don't play with my cards close to my chest at all. They're right out on the table, and so I don't play poker because it's not a good idea in these circumstances. So I can actually say that last night I did spend quite a long time with the 2016, the 2017, and the 2018 vintage ports of Quinta Noval. I call this research, just so you know. And I was sitting with them because I was trying to situate 2018, and I absolutely adore the 16s and 17s, and I wanted to be quite sure that how 18 fitted in. Actually, I had the 15 as well, but we'll leave the 15 out for now. And I actually think that I could sort of stick my neck out a little bit. I think the mixing metaphor is sticking your neck out and putting your cards open on the table. But anyway, 16 I thought was a really beautiful year. We had a long ripening season. We had enough rainfall, and 16 is what I think of as being a very classical, balanced, harmonious, beautiful year with wonderful freshness, wonderful structure. And then 17 was not at all the same kind of year. 17 was a year of extremes with a lot of heat spikes and extreme droughts, and yet the 17s are just wonderful because there's an exuberant wildness about the 17s that I really adore. So I think of 16 as being a grand classic aristocratic sort of vintage, and the 17s being rather wild and wonderful. And I actually would slot 2018 almost exactly in between the two of them, because I think that it has some of the freshness, balance, and harmony of the 16s, but it's got a little bit of that exuberance, the aromatic exuberance of the 17s, which I love as well. And so I think a little, I don't expect if I'd mixed up a glass of 17 and 16, it would have been like 18. It's not that precise, but there's a little something of both the 16s and the 17 in the 18. And it certainly, it works for me anyway.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. We've had another question more on the business side of vintage port, which is interesting. From the perspective of running a business, how do port houses handle the intermittent cash flow implications of sometimes there being sizable gaps in declared years and good vintages?
Well,
no one's prepared to start that one. Christian, why don't you kick off with that?
Something. In the case of Quinta de Noval, vintage port it actually represents quite a small proportion of our production. I mean, we make very tiny amounts of vintage port at Quinta de Noval, and I think the business answer is that the business has to turn and work on all the other ports you make. And there's a lot of them, the great LBVs, the 10-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, colliators. You have an entire range of port, and you have very large stocks. Of course, the size of businesses varies, and my business is much, much smaller than Symington's business. But you need to be able to function and turn a decent profit on your regular, all the other wines that you sell. And then when vintage port comes along, it's very nice as a sort of extra. But we don't, certainly not at Noval, and I'm sure not at the Symingtons, we don't sort of wait desperately for a vintage and sort of starving in the meantime. We are turning our business over on all the other wines we make.
And Harry and Dom, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd say we'd agree. The focus is on the rest of the portfolio, the rest of our wines. And as Christian says, when a vintage comes along, when the quality is there, it's very fortunate. But we don't sit around sort of waiting for it. The focus needs to be on the other wines, and that's where it is.
I think if I could add to that, it's a little bit like the way the Wine Society operates. Our Primeur sales are kept entirely separate from our regular sales. The business lives and breathes on its regular sales. Our Primeur sales, whether it's vintage port or Bordeaux or Burgundy, are, if you like, the icing on the cake. Some years they'll be very generous, some years less so. But the business has to work on those regular running lines, which are the ports that most of us will be drinking most of the time. Let's face it, most of us, perhaps it's different for you guys that produce it, but most of us don't drink vintage port often enough. But having said that, I can fully admit to the fact that I have a rather unbalanced cellar. I have plenty of port that's going to see us through many years, and I keep buying a little bit because I think these are exceptional wines. They do keep. You can enjoy them at various different stages of life, and they are a treat. I mean, I've loved introducing vintage port to friends, family, and also to the younger generation. I bought some 1998 vintage Senhora de Ribeira because that was my daughter's birth year. that was another complicated vintage in a different way. It was rather wet, wasn't it? I gather from what you explained when we tasted the wine together recently, Harry and Dom. But the pleasure that we've had in having that wine and enjoying that wine at a dinner party for her 18th, and then at a dinner party for her 21st, which was only last year, and the wine still got a future ahead of it. She's lucky enough to have a few magnums as well, which of course will last a little bit longer. And it's just a pleasure. And the youngsters really enjoyed that wine, much more than the other wines that I'd kept of her birth year, because unless you're used to wine, it's a bit hard to come to terms with those wines. But of course, the sweetness and generosity of a vintage port, and the youngsters loved it. And I really hope that port is now on their radar, if you like.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joe. And I'm very jealous of your daughter's wine cellar. Green with envy. We have a question from Mike Bullitt. He's asking, having seen a few of these webinars, growers have talked about taking their production organic and some even into the realms of biodiversity. Mike says he's not aware of any port producers going down either route and was wondering your thoughts on the subject. Perhaps Symington's, we could start with you.
So we produce the Graham's Natura, which is an organic port. It's produced from a few parcels of vineyard at Noval, which are organically farmed. We see that the response to it is certainly growing. It's an exciting area, and I think it's an area that Charles is interested to explore. In terms of viticulture, all of our vineyards are farmed under a sort of minimum intervention certification, which means that we use as few sort of interventions as is possible. But certainly from what we've seen and the way that ship in tastes are going, is that actually people do want to be purchasing organically grown, organically produced port, and it's certainly an area that we and Charles as head winemaker are looking into and exploring.
Thank you. And Christian, what's your view on organics, biodynamics, etc.?
Very similar. We farm our vines on the same minimal intervention basis. In fact, you're not very even if you're not trying to be organic, in many ways you're not that far off in the door anyhow, because one of the most difficult parts of viticulture in other parts of the world is the threat of rot and rotten various different fungi like oidium and mildew, which happen when you have a lot of rainfall during the summer. Well, that's not actually something that we normally have to worry about too much, and so we're treating against those things much less than people might have to in other parts of the world anyway. And I think that I think we're all very conscious of the fact that the quality of these wines comes from the vineyard, and it's our historic responsibility to look after these vineyards and hand them on to future generations in a better state than they were before, and minimal intervention is exactly what you need to do to be able to do that. Of course, it's rather important to grow grapes and make wine as well, and so sometimes you have to you have to intervene in order to make sure that there's a crop. At Quinta Noval, in fact, the National parcel is farmed entirely organically using horses and not tractors. But that, when you're up 2 hectares, you can sort of, you can do that. I'm not sure if I could. We'd need an awful lot of horses for 145 hectares. So we're not there yet. But most certainly, the underlying principle is a profound respect for the land and for nature, and an awareness that nature is what gives us the wine that we love, and we have to look after it.
Yeah, I mean, exactly what we do. It's You know, we let the vineyards, we let the vineyard speak in the wine, and we do as little as conceivably possible. And there's a principle within this sustainable farming, which is a thing called the economic injury level, which means that you can afford to lose a certain amount of your crop if it's cheaper than treating it, because you're going to spend the money. So don't spend the money to do any form of intervention if you know how much you're going to lose. And therefore it means that we can, and that's one of the key ways that we've reduced any form of non-natural intervention in vineyards. And so I would say largely we in the Douro, and I mean not only us here in this forum, but in the Douro, I would probably say that 4 out of 5 years we're 100% organic farming in any case, because as Christian said, that we're very lucky with our climate. And so, you know, I think that largely we're respecting our environment.
Fantastic, thank you. I've got a quick question, for Christian on the point of environment, vineyard maintenance, etc. David Waterhouse says that he had the pleasure of visiting Noval and Vesuvio in 2013 and asked why Noval had never propagated their pre-phylloxera vines to extend the national parcel.
Well, actually, we've tried doing that because it is rather wonderful to have the national vineyard, and it does make absolutely extraordinary port when it doesn't get hailed on. And so in the past, we have actually taken cuttings from the national parcel and tried planting them in other parts of the vineyard to see if we could have a bit more of that, please. And it hasn't worked. The national parcel is a very mysterious thing. We really don't know why the ungrafted vines survive there, but they do, and they don't seem to get on anywhere else. So no, we one or two experiments have been tried, but totally unsuccessfully on our part of planting ungrafted vines directly and using plant material from the national parcel as well in other parts of the vineyard, but not successful. So the national just remains what it is, a very tiny vineyard making very lovely wine from time to time.
Fabulous, thank you. Special, but perhaps not repeatable. I'm going to combine a couple of questions because I'm quite conscious of time. So perhaps if the Symingtons, you could kick off. There are a few members asking how long they should keep vintage port open and also how long they should decant it.
Well, to start, how long should we keep a bottle of vintage port open? I mean, the rude answer is I have no idea, because I've never kept it longer than the supper that I'm drinking it at. But to be serious, and with due apologies to everyone, vintage port, it's like a robust red wine, and whereby because it's got a slightly higher alcohol content, and there is a slightly higher residual sugar content in the wine than you would find in the port, than you would find in a wine that once opened, if it's a youngish wine, you can probably keep it for 4 or 5 days. I wouldn't recommend going much beyond that. I know some people do, but I wouldn't. As the wine gets older, and particularly after about 30, 35 years of age, I wouldn't recommend keeping a bottle open after a couple of days, because the wines become much more delicate, and therefore they would then have the risk of oxidizing. Decanting, it's a bit of a long shot, because in my experience, there isn't a youngish wine up to 20 years. Probably give it a few hours, 4 or 5 hours before serving. But it's not critical. I mean, I know I've been at table with Christian, and he's been at table with me, and we've gone to the cellar and opened a bottle and drank it within about 5 minutes of pulling the cork. But that's normally quite late at night. When you get to very, very old vintage ports, and I speak well over 50 years of age, it's a little bit of a lottery, because some bottles it's just like opening a very old red wine. You open the bottle, sometimes you open them and they need to breathe in air a little bit to blow off a bit of bottle stink. Other times you open the bottle and you need to drink it within the half an hour because it will then fall apart. So I'm afraid I don't really have a clear answer on that one. Christian, I don't know what you would have to say, but it's not an easy answer, that one. It's slightly, it's a sort of, it's, you know, take it as it comes situation.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that on the first part of the question, except when I'm entertaining very, you know, enthusiastic port drinkers and I have to go down to the cellar and get more wine, I would normally I'd open a bottle of vintage port at about 7 o'clock on the basis that we're going to drink it at about 10:30 or something like that. It does occasionally happen that, you know, there's some wine left in the decanter, and it can actually sometimes happen that the next day it can be even better. So I think that the first 24 hours it's really quite beneficial for the wine to be decanted and open, and then probably after 2 days it's still going to be good, but you're in a bit of a slow decline after that. There's oxidation is happening. If you really want it to be as good as it ought to be, you know, just you have to make a big effort and try and drink it all in the first 2 days. That's what I would say.
Fabulous, thank you very much. We have a question from John Blake. He's looking for some recommendations. He said, if your budget doesn't always stretch to vintage port, then what is the next best alternative? So, Christian, should we start with you since you've got no poker face?
Late bottle vintage port, of course. At Quinta Noval, one of the, you know, the question was posed before, what do we do with all the other port when we make, we've been talking about these tiny percentages that are used to make vintage port. A significant proportion of the very best wines at Quinta Noval, which are trodden by foot in lagars, are going to make our Quinta Noval late bottled vintage port, which in the case of the Quinta Noval late bottled vintage port is 100% foot trodden, and it's unfiltered, and it's serious stuff. It's a wine I take very seriously indeed, because I'm well aware that for a lot of people it's the you know, the best way of coming in contact with a wine that's from Quinta Noval and carrying that signature of quality, and it's obviously at a much more approachable price than vintage port. So I think that serious late bottled vintage from a good producer such as either us or them, you know, is a pretty serious recommendation, because you're getting very high class bottle of port for what is tragically low sums as far as we're concerned, but that's just how it is. The LBVs, I think, are a very, very good value for money.
Fantastic. And Dom, Harry?
Yeah, we would agree. Late bottled vintage, like Christian's saying, you're getting a fantastic quality wine for the price that it's at, or a premium ruby. I would also say on the other, we talked about Tawny a little bit this evening, and I know that in the summer our sort of go-to port is a 20-year-old. So we've tasted Senhora of Ribeira, which is Dow's. Dow's aged Tawny range is fantastic, and actually just a chilled glass of 20-year-old Tawny in the summer, there's nothing really better. So that would be my go-to as a substitute at a more sort of affordable price.
And Joe, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I would just going to add a comment there that if you're starting out on a port journey, learning about port, there are delicious, easily accessible pouring wines that don't need to be decanted or kept. But then if you can then work your way up to from the likes of a traditional LBV or a traditional crusted port, which do need decanting, and they're wines that, of course, they don't have the same longevity as a traditional vintage port or a single quinta wine like the wines we've been discussing tonight. But they are wines that will improve with time in bottle. So I think you can get a little bit of an indication and get an understanding if that is something that you like, if you like that the pleasure of seeing how the wine develops for a relatively modest outlay, you can do that with some of those grades of port, traditional LBV, crusted, before then investing more and thinking, yes, you know, this is for me. I'm going to move up the scale through single quinta and to classic vintage ports. So I think there's the beauty of port is that there is really good port at all levels, and you can explore them. You know, some people might go right in at the top, but you can explore them and work your way up to them if your finances or your taste isn't yet ready for the classic vintage. So I think there's plenty to choose from. Really, it's
And Joe,
drink more port.
and to be clear, Joe, for those LBV wines, so the late bottled vintage, the crusted, they will naturally mature a little faster, won't they? So you don't have to, you know, you don't have to lay them down for a long time in order to appreciate some of those developed flavors.
Absolutely not. The wines tend to be released when they've had a little bit of time in bottle anyway, and then they don't need as much time in bottle. They won't develop over such a long period. So they're very much more accessible when they're younger. But yes, it's a little bit like, you know, you can buy a good Petit Chateau Bordeaux and cellar it for a few years. It won't mature in the same way as Chateau Pichon Baron, which is another wine that Christian looks after. But on the other hand, you can get some pleasure from watching that wine, more modest wine, develop over time. And that can then introduce you to that whole process, which is such a joy, you know, and it can be such a wonderful discovery. So yeah, I would certainly recommend doing it that way if you're starting out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. By the sounds of things, we've got a real mixture of what people are drinking here. And we've got people right at the beginning of port journeys, and then people who have clearly got a selection in their cellar that they've managed to pluck something delicious to enjoy this evening's session. That does leave us with just 5 minutes to spare. So I hoped I could hand over to you, Joe, to finish, but also to explain the offer and the reason that we're doing this event, and explain to members when they'll be able to buy these delicious wines.
Of course, thank you. Well, firstly, I would like to say a huge thank you to our speakers for giving up their evening on a beautiful sunny evening in the Douro Valley. Thank you for your time. I know that you are, if you're not already supposed to be on holiday, you're approaching your holidays and you're approaching an early harvest. So best wishes to you for this year's harvest, which is going to come upon us all too soon. And thank you so much for the background that you've given us to this harvest, to the 2018 vintage, which are the wines are about to be or have just been bottled. So as other merchants have been doing already, we are about to offer these wines, just these 3 wines. Our offer goes out next week. Other producers, you know already that the Symingtons made other wines, and other producers also made wines, but not necessarily released this year. Hence, it's a very small selection. You can buy those wines standalone, or you can buy them in a mixed case, if that idea appeals to you. Again, that's another route in to buying on Primeur. And then those wines won't be delivered for some time, classically Primeur process. And yeah, whether it's these wines or other ports, I can wholly recommend them. I have had the privilege of tasting them and they were delicious. Generous wines, as we've heard, but with a lovely freshness that I think is important. Sometimes in the past, that bit more grip that Christian described helped to give the wine freshness. Here, there's a lovely natural balance between that lovely ripe fruit, which of course is going to be so generous when it's very carefully selected, with that national freshness that you've got from the altitude, you know, where we've been able to play with the altitude across the 3 vineyards in question. So yeah, highly recommended. Do take a look at the offer, even if it's not for you. It hopefully will make interesting research. And do, if you haven't had chance already, do have a look at the videos that I think, Anna, you mentioned you're going to resend in the follow-up email, because for those of you who haven't been to the Douro, it is one of the most spectacular wine regions in the world. And this will they will really help to put into perspective everything that our three speakers have been talking about the complexity of the vineyards, the different aspects, in one of the most special places in the world. So thank you very much for attending, and a huge thank you again to our speakers and to all of those on the technical side behind the scenes who have made this happen, whether they've been visible or not. Thank you all for everything you've done to make this evening a success. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, and I'd like to second a thanks to all the members joining this evening. We hope you've learnt lots, had great experiences. A thanks to you, Joe, for being a wonderful compere and such a source of knowledge for all things port. And I'd like to raise a glass to the three gentlemen. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. My white port and tonic is finished, but I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and a huge, huge thank you on behalf of the tastings team and all the members at the Wine Society.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right. Bye, Christian.
Hi, Dominic.